The restraints around my wrists were cold enough to burn. I did not understand the language the guards spoke, but I understood the tone. It was the same tone a person uses when they step over a bug on the sidewalk without looking down. My name is Eli Barnes. 3 days ago, I was the least impressive soldier in my unit. Today, I was cargo. The ship shuddered as it dropped out of some kind of folded space, and through the narrow slit of a window, I saw it for the first time. A world of towers and smoke, purple skies streaked with moving light. The Kryvax homeworld. I had heard the name whispered in briefings back on Earth, always followed by a long silence. Now I knew why. They marched us, 12 of us, down a ramp and into a hall taller than any building I had ever stood inside. My squad mates walked ahead of me, and even in chains, they looked like they belonged there. Captain Daniel Cross, built like a wall, jaw set, eyes scanning for any weakness in the guards. Beside him, Marcus Bell, our team's heavy weapons specialist, arms thick as tree trunks even after days without food. Grace Whitfield, our sniper, moved like she was still counting exits, still planning an escape that would never come. And then there was me, skinny, slouched, the kind of soldier who got assigned to supply runs because command did not trust me with anything that mattered. A group of aliens stood on a raised platform above the hall, watching us through some kind of floating scanner devices. Each device hovered near a prisoner, painted a strip of light across their body, then displayed numbers in the air: strength, speed, reaction time, endurance. The Kryvax leaned forward with interest as the numbers appeared over Cross. Impressive, one of them said, in halting words translated through a device on his chest. Then the light moved to Bell, and their interest grew. Then to Whitfield. Then, finally, to me. The numbers over my head were small, almost embarrassingly small. Somewhere in the group of aliens, one of them made a sound I did not need translated. It was a laugh. The lead Kryvax, a tall creature with layered plates of dark blue skin and eyes like polished stone, walked closer to study me. He tilted his head the way a person might look at a broken tool they were deciding whether to throw away. "This one," he said, "is nothing." Another alien beside him said something short, and the whole platform laughed again. The translator device caught only fragments, but I understood enough. They were giving me a nickname, something that meant small, something that meant waste. The closest word I could match it to was runt. I kept my face empty. I had learned a long time ago that showing what you feel only gives people more reasons to keep hurting you. They separated us into holding cells after that. Mine was small, the walls a strange material that pulsed faintly, like it was breathing. Through a barred opening, I could see into the cell across from mine, where Cross sat with his back straight, still watching everything, still calculating. "They are underestimating you," he said, after a while. "That is not a bad thing, Barnes." I did not have anything to say to that, so I just nodded. A guard came for me not long after. He was shorter than the others, more of an administrator than a soldier, and he carried a thin data slate that glowed with symbols I could not read. He studied me the way a farmer studies livestock before deciding which one goes to slaughter first. "You," he said through his translator. "Arena first match, tomorrow." My stomach dropped, but I did not let it show on my face. "Why me?" I asked. He almost smiled. "Because you will lose fast," he said. "Good for opening match, warm the crowd, then real fighters come after." He walked away, and I sat alone in that cell for a long time, staring at the pulsing wall, trying to understand what kind of place would treat killing like a sport with an opening act. Later that night, a different guard came, this one taller, with markings I had not seen before, likely some kind of rank insignia. She studied the readouts on her slate, glanced at me, then spoke words that the translator rendered flatly. "You are called Runt now," she said. "Word has already spread across the lower decks. They say you will die in less time than it takes to announce your name." I let that sit in the air for a moment. "Do you believe that?" I asked. She tilted her head, the closest thing to a shrug I had seen from her kind. "I have seen 1,000 matches," she said. "I have never seen your species fight. I do not know what to believe." That was more honesty than I expected from anyone since I had been captured, so I held on to it. After she left, I lay back against the wall and thought about the arena. I did not know what it looked like yet, but I knew what it meant. It meant an audience. It meant rules, because every civilization that puts violence on display for entertainment eventually invents rules to keep it entertaining rather than simply chaotic. Rules could be studied. Rules could be used. Back on Earth, I had never been the strongest soldier in any room. I had never won a single physical contest against Cross or Bell or anyone else in my unit, but I had spent years being underestimated, being the last one picked, being the one nobody expected anything from. And in that time, I had learned something the biggest, strongest people in my life never had to learn. When the world expects nothing from you, you get to choose exactly how much they see coming. The next morning came fast. Guards pulled me from the cell before I had barely slept, marched me down a long corridor lined with strange murals depicting past champions, alien figures frozen mid-strike, wings and claws and armor plating rendered in triumphant poses. Somewhere far ahead, I could hear something that sounded like a crowd, a low roar building into something sharper. They pushed me through a final gate, and the light hit me first, blinding after the dim corridors. Then the sound hit me. A wall of noise from thousands of alien voices packed into a stadium that curved up and around in every direction. Tier after tier of creatures I had never seen before, all of them here to watch someone like me lose. In the center of the arena floor stood my opponent. He was easily twice my height, plated in dark armor that looked grown rather than built, and he was already looking at me the way the Kryvax commander had looked at me the day before, like I was already finished. The crowd roared his name, something long and hard to pronounce. Then, almost as an afterthought, someone announced mine, and the crowd's roar shifted into laughter, a wave of it rolling around the stadium like they were all in on the same joke. I stood at the edge of the sand, feeling the heat radiating up from the ground, feeling every eye in that stadium waiting for the fastest match they had ever seen. I did not feel confident. I did not feel brave. What I felt, standing there, was something colder and steadier. I felt the same thing I had always felt right before every unfair fight of my entire life. I felt like I had absolutely nothing left to lose, and everything left to prove. The horn sounded, sharp and metallic, echoing across the stadium, and the crowd's laughter turned into a roar of anticipation. My opponent moved first, faster than something his size had any right to be, and I understood in that instant that surviving the next few seconds was going to require every trick I had ever learned, and a few I would have to invent on the spot. I did not run toward him. I did not run away either. I moved sideways, low, watching his weight shift, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a calm voice reminded me of the one advantage nobody in that stadium had bothered to calculate. They had scanned my strength. They had scanned my speed. They had never thought to scan how much I had learned from a lifetime of being underestimated. The match had only just begun, and already, I could see the first crack in his form, the first opening nobody trained to fight the strong ever thinks to protect. He struck at where my head had been a heartbeat earlier, and the ground where I had stood cracked under the force of it. I felt the shock of it through my boots even from 3 steps away. If that blow had landed, the match would have ended before the crowd finished laughing. I circled him, staying low, staying loose, watching the way his weight rocked forward every time he swung. He was strong, faster than I expected, but he moved like every strong thing I had ever fought back on Earth. He moved like someone who had never needed a plan, because his size had always been the plan. I feinted left. He committed to the block before I had even finished the motion, and in that half-second, I saw everything I needed to see. His stance recovered too slowly after a full swing. There was a gap, brief, almost nothing, right after he missed. The crowd was not laughing anymore. I could feel that change in the air, even without understanding a single word they shouted. A hush had crept into parts of the stadium, the kind of quiet that comes when an audience realizes the outcome they paid for might not be guaranteed after all. He swung again, a wide arcing blow meant to end things quickly, and I dropped instead of retreating, sliding low across the sand, past his reach, past the plates of armor on his legs, and up on the other side of him before he had fully turned. For one moment, his back was open. I did not have strength. I did not have size. What I had was the 2 full seconds his recovery gave me, and I used every part of them. By the time he turned to find me again, something in his stance had changed. He was slower now, more careful, and I understood that I had done something none of the aliens in that stadium had expected. I had made him afraid of me, even if only for an instant. The rest of the match blurred together, a series of small decisions made faster than thought. Every time he tried to use his size, I used the ground, the space, the 2 full body lengths he needed to turn that I did not. Every time he tried to corner me, I remembered every argument I had ever lost as a kid to bigger brothers and older cousins, every fight I had learned to survive rather than win outright. When the horn finally sounded again, signaling the end of the match, I was still standing. He was not. The stadium went utterly silent. I stood there in the sudden quiet, chest heaving, sand clinging to my skin, and looked up at the platform where the Kryvax commander had called me nothing the day before. He was standing now, gripping the railing, staring down at me with an expression his kind clearly did not wear often. It was not anger. It was something closer to confusion. The guards who escorted me back to the holding cells did not speak to me the way they had before. They kept glancing at me sideways, like they were trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly changed shape in their hands. Back in the cell block, Cross was waiting at the bars of his own cell when they brought me past. "You won," he said. It was not a question. I nodded, still catching my breath. "How?" he asked. I thought about that for a long moment before I answered. "They only measured what I could lift," I said. "Nobody measured what I could see." Cross studied me for a moment longer, something shifting behind his eyes, a kind of respect I had never once earned from him back on Earth. "Then get some rest, Runt," he said, and for the first time since they had given me that name, it did not sound like an insult at all. That night, alone in my cell, I did not sleep much. My body ached in places I did not know could ache, but my mind would not stop turning over everything that had happened. One win did not mean survival. It meant attention. And in a place like this, attention from the wrong audience could be far more dangerous than being ignored ever was. The tall guard from the night before came again, later, after the noise of the stadium had faded into the distance. She studied her data slate, then looked at me with an expression I could not fully read. "They are already talking about you," she said, "all across the lower decks. The one they called Nothing." "What are they saying?" I asked. She hesitated, the closest thing to genuine curiosity I had seen from any of them. "They are saying you cheated," she said, "that you used tricks unworthy of the arena." "Did I break any rules?" I asked. She considered the question with more seriousness than I expected. "No," she admitted. "You broke no rules. You simply used ones nobody expected a small creature to understand." I let that settle over me like something solid I could hold on to. "Then tomorrow," I said, "they will have to write new rules if they want to stop me from doing it again." She studied me for a long moment, and for the first time, there was no mockery in her expression at all. "Rules do not change quickly here," she said. "But perhaps, for the first time in a long while, someone is finally giving them a reason to." She left after that, and I lay back against the cold wall of my cell, staring up at Nothing, replaying every second of the fight in my mind, searching for weaknesses in my own approach before someone bigger and smarter found them for me first. I understood something in that quiet, something that would carry me through every fight still to come. They had scanned my body and found nothing worth fearing, but nobody in that entire arena had thought to measure the one thing that had kept me alive my entire life, long before any of them had ever heard the name Eli Barnes. They had not measured how much I refused to lose. 3 days passed before they came for me again, and in that time, I learned more about the arena than any guard would have willingly told me. I learned it from watching, from listening, from paying attention the way I always had, because paying attention was the one skill nobody could ever take away from me. The Kryvax did not fight for conquest alone. They fought for belief. Every match in that stadium was broadcast across every world they had ever taken, a constant reminder to 100 conquered species that the strong ruled and the weak obeyed. It was propaganda wrapped in spectacle, and it had worked for longer than human history had even existed. There were rules, just as I suspected. Some matches ended at first blood, others ended only when one fighter could no longer stand. Interference from outside the ring was forbidden, a rule so deeply respected that even guards who despised a fighter would not dare break it, because breaking it meant dishonoring the entire system that kept their empire together. I learned this from a small creature named Odo, a translator assigned to feed information to fighters before their matches, a being from a species the Kryvax had conquered generations earlier. Odo had 6 eyes and a voice like static settling into words, and he seemed to enjoy talking to me more than any Kryvax ever had. "You surprised them," Odo said, on the second day, while delivering a tray of food I did not entirely trust. "Nobody expects a small species to understand strategy. They believe strength is intelligence here." "Is it?" I asked. Odo made a sound that might have been a laugh, if a laugh could rustle like dry leaves. "No," he said, "but belief and truth are rarely the same thing, even among the powerful." I asked him about the other species he had seen come through the arena. He listed names I could not pronounce, describing warriors who had won a match or two before eventually losing to something stronger, faster, or simply less tired. Nobody, he said, had ever won more than 3 matches without eventually falling. "Why?" I asked. "Because eventually," he said, "the arena stops sending ordinary opponents. It starts sending its best." I thought about that for a long while after he left. If I kept winning, they would keep raising the difficulty, testing me against fighters trained specifically to counter whatever made me different. That was, In some strange way, exactly the kind of problem I understood best. I had spent my entire life being tested by people who assumed my weaknesses were permanent, never realizing that every loss taught me something they never bothered to learn from their own victories. Cross found ways to speak with me during exercise periods, when guards allowed prisoners brief walks through a shared corridor. He studied me differently now, less like a soldier assessing a liability, more like someone trying to understand a weapon he had never encountered before. "You are thinking like a strategist," he said one afternoon, keeping his voice low. "Where did you learn that?" "Nowhere official," I admitted, "just years of being the smallest person in every room I ever walked into." Bell, walking beside him, snorted. "Back home, you could barely keep up on training runs," he said, though there was no real venom in it anymore, just genuine confusion. "Running in a straight line was never my problem," I said. "Reading what people were about to do before they did it, that was the only fight I ever consistently won." Whitfield, quiet as always, studied me with sharper eyes than either of the men beside her. "That is not luck," she said. "That is observation. You have been doing that since we arrived here, haven't you? Watching everything." I nodded. There was no point denying it. "If I only had strength to rely on," I said, "I would already be dead. Since I don't have that, I have to use whatever else is left." They did not laugh at that the way people back home might have. Something had changed between us since that first match. Some old assumption finally broken apart and rebuilt into something closer to respect. My second match came sooner than expected, only 5 days after the first. This time the opponent was different. Not a single hulking warrior, but a pair of smaller, faster Kryvax fighters, clearly meant to counter whatever advantage speed and low profile had given me before. The commander on the platform, the one who had once called me nothing, watched with unreadable eyes as the horn sounded. The two fighters split immediately, one circling left, one circling right, coordinating with a kind of practiced ease that told me they had trained together for a long time. I understood instantly that trying to outthink two opponents at once required a completely different approach than facing one. I moved toward the one on my left before they had fully committed to their positions, closing distance faster than either expected, forcing them to adjust their spacing at a moment they had clearly not planned for. The one on the right hesitated, unsure whether to close in or hold position, and that hesitation was all I needed. The fight that followed was longer, messier, more exhausting than the first. I took a solid hit across my shoulder that sent pain rolling down my entire arm, a mistake in judgment I would not repeat again. But mistakes, I had learned long ago, were only fatal if you failed to learn from them fast enough to survive the very next moment. By the time the horn sounded again, both fighters were down, and I was still standing, breathing hard, blood trickling from a shallow cut above my eyebrow that stung more than it actually hurt. The stadium did not laugh this time. The silence that followed was heavier than before, thick with something that felt almost like disbelief settling across thousands of alien faces at once. Odo found me afterward, his 6 eyes wide with something between excitement and worry. 2 wins, he said. They will not send ordinary fighters again. Whatever comes next will be built specifically to end you. I understood that. I had understood it from the very beginning. Every victory bought me another match. And every match after this one would be harder than the last, engineered by an empire that had never once needed to consider defeat as a possibility until a soldier they called nothing had shown them otherwise. That night, back in my cell, I allowed myself, for the first time since capture, a small and quiet feeling I almost did not recognize anymore. It was not confidence exactly. It was something closer to purpose. Back on Earth, nobody had ever needed me to succeed. I was simply there, filling a role nobody expected much from, quietly overlooked in every room I entered. Here, in this arena built entirely around the worship of strength, something had shifted. My survival had become something other prisoners were beginning to watch. Something other conquered species across 100 broadcasted worlds were beginning to notice. I did not know yet how far that noticing would travel, or how much it would eventually cost the empire that had built this arena to prove a point it never expected to lose. I only knew that the next match would come, and when it did, I intended to be ready for whatever new nightmare they built specifically to break me. The weeks that followed blurred into a rhythm I never expected to grow used to. Fight, recover, observe, fight again. Each match arrived faster than the last, and each opponent came better prepared for whatever trick I had used the time before. The Kryvax were not foolish. They studied their losses with the same intensity they once reserved only for celebrating their wins, and I understood that every advantage I found would only work once before they adapted against it. My fourth match brought an opponent trained specifically to fight low and close, Someone clearly instructed to remove the very techniques that had worked against the first two fighters. My fifth brought two opponents again, but spaced differently, coordinated in a way meant to punish exactly the tactic I had used before. Each time, I had to think faster, adjust quicker, invent something new in the middle of a fight, rather than relying on anything I had already shown them. I won every time, barely, painfully, but every time. Odo brought me news between matches that I had no other way of hearing. He told me the broadcasts of my fights were being watched across dozens of conquered worlds, species I had never heard of, gathering around communal viewing devices to watch a small, unremarkable creature from a species called human refuse to fall the way the arena's rules said he should. "They are calling you something new now," Odo told me one evening, his 6 eyes catching the dim light of my cell. "Not runt anymore." "What then?" I asked. He hesitated, choosing the translation carefully. "The word roughly means, the one who was not measured correctly," he said. "Some species have shortened it. They simply call you the unmeasured." I turned that name over in my mind for a long while after he left. It fit better than runt ever had. The Kryvax had built an entire empire on the belief that strength could be measured, ranked, and used to justify who ruled and who obeyed. I had broken that assumption without ever intending to, simply by refusing to lose in the one way their measurements said I should. Cross noticed the shift happening around us long before I fully understood its size. During one of our shared exercise periods, he pulled me aside, his voice lower than usual. "The guards are treating us differently," he said. "Have you noticed?" I had noticed. The guards who once shoved us through corridors without a second glance now watched me with something between caution and curiosity. Some avoided meeting my eyes entirely. Others studied me like they were trying to memorize something before it disappeared. "You are becoming a problem for them," Cross said. "Not just in the arena, outside it too." Bell, listening nearby, crossed his massive arms and studied me with an expression that had changed completely since our capture. "Back home," he admitted, quietly, "I never thought much of you, Barnes. No offense." "None taken," I said. "I never thought much of me either." He almost smiled at that, an expression I had never once seen him wear before our capture. Whitfield, always watching more than she spoke, finally broke her silence during one of those exercise periods. "Other prisoners are asking about you," she said. "Not just humans. Other species held in the lower cell blocks. They want to know how someone so unremarkable keeps surviving against fighters built to end things quickly." "What do you tell them?" I asked. She studied me for a long moment before answering. "I tell them the truth," she said, "that you were always paying closer attention than any of us ever gave you credit for." The Kryvax leadership, according to what Odo carefully gathered from higher-ranking guards, had begun holding private discussions about what my continued survival meant for the Empire's broader message. An empire built on the idea that strength alone determined worth could not easily explain why the weakest prisoner they had ever scanned kept defeating fighters specifically trained to counter him. Some among them wanted me eliminated quietly, removed from the broadcast schedule entirely before my survival undermined too much of what the arena was built to represent. Others, apparently including the commander who had once called me nothing, argued for something different. They wanted to end my streak publicly, decisively, in a way so complete that it would erase any doubt the Empire's foundational belief had ever been shaken. That second argument won. Odo delivered the news to me with visible unease in his 6 shifting eyes. "They are bringing their greatest champion," he said, "a warrior undefeated across 300 matches. They intend to end this in front of every world watching, all at once." I absorbed that information the way I had absorbed every piece of bad news since my capture, quietly, without letting it show on my face, filing it away as simply another problem to solve rather than a fate to fear. "When is the match?" I asked. 7 days, Odo said. "They want time to build the broadcast into something the entire Empire will watch together. They want your defeat to mean something impossible to argue against." I understood immediately what that meant. This would not be an ordinary fight buried among dozens of others across a busy schedule. This would be the fight, the one meant to settle the question my survival had raised across 100 worlds, the one meant to prove, once and for all, that the Empire's belief in strength above everything else remained unbroken. 7 days was not long to prepare against an opponent I had never seen fight, someone who had survived 300 matches against creatures far stronger than anything I had faced so far. But 7 days was also not nothing, and I intended to use every single hour of it. That night, I asked Odo everything he could tell me about the champion the Kryvax were bringing. His name, once translated, meant something close to unbroken wall. He had never lost. He had never even come close to losing, according to every record Odo could access. He fought with a discipline the other opponents I had faced clearly lacked, patient, calculating, never rushing into the kind of overextension I had exploited so many times already. He does not make mistakes, Odo said, his voice quieter than usual. He has never needed to learn from a loss, because he has never experienced one. I sat with that information for a long while after Odo left, turning it over the way I turned over every problem that once seemed impossible to solve. An opponent who never made mistakes sounded unbeatable, until I remembered something I had learned a long time ago, back before any of this began, back when I was simply the smallest, least impressive soldier, in a unit that never expected much from me at all. Perfect opponents were dangerous specifically because they had never needed to prepare for anything unpredictable. Their strength was built entirely on discipline, on patterns refined across 300 victories that had never once required improvisation. I did not have 300 victories. I did not have discipline built across a lifetime of dominance. What I had, instead, was an entire life spent losing to bigger, stronger, more confident opponents, and surviving anyway by refusing to fight the way they expected. 7 days was not much time to prepare for the fight of my life. But 7 days was exactly the amount of time I intended to spend becoming something the Empire's greatest champion had never once been forced to face. Someone with absolutely nothing to lose, and an entire lifetime of practice at being underestimated. The 7 days passed in a strange mixture of urgency and stillness. Guards allowed me longer exercise periods than before, likely under orders to keep me sharp enough for a spectacle they wanted to remember for generations. I used every extra minute they gave me, running drills in my head long before my body ever moved, replaying every fight I had already survived, searching for patterns I had missed the first time. Cross helped where he could, sharing what little he remembered from military training that might apply against an opponent built entirely around discipline and patience. Bell talked me through the mechanics of fighting something far larger than myself, drawing on years of close combat training I had never possessed. Whitfield, quiet as ever, offered the most valuable insight of all. He has never lost, she said during one of our shared exercise periods. That means he has never had to think about losing. Every one of his 300 wins has taught him the same lesson, over and over. That patience and discipline always succeed. You need to find a way to make that lesson stop being true, even for just one moment. I turned her words over for the rest of that day, letting them settle into something I could actually use. An opponent who had never lost, had never needed to develop a response to genuine surprise. His 300 victories were built on facing predictable resistance, opponents who fought the way strength always fought, directly, aggressively, in ways his discipline had learned to counter perfectly. I was not going to fight him the way strength fought. I had never once won a fight that way in my entire life. Odo continued bringing information whenever he could slip away from his other duties, describing details about the champion's fighting style gathered from older broadcasts he managed to access through channels he refused to fully explain. The champion, whose name I had begun privately shortening to Kaltor for my own sanity, fought with a rhythm built around controlled aggression, always advancing, always pressuring, never allowing an opponent room to think. He does not chase, Odo explained. He waits for you to come to him, and when you do, he ends things quickly. Every fighter who has ever tried to outlast him through patience has lost exactly the same way. He is more patient than anyone who has ever faced him. That detail mattered more than anything else Odo told me. If patience was the trap most fighters fell into against him, then patience was not the answer. I needed something entirely different, something his 300 victories had never once required him to prepare against. I spent the final 2 days before the match doing something none of my squad mates fully understood. I stopped training the way a soldier trains for combat, and started thinking the way I used to think as a kid, back when losing every physical contest against people bigger and stronger than me had forced me to find advantages nobody else considered worth studying. I studied the arena itself, every detail Odo could describe about its layout, its lighting, the exact placement of the platform where the Kryvax leadership would watch. I studied the broadcast schedule, understanding that this match would be different from everyone before it, watched not by a partially filled stadium but by every world the Empire had ever conquered, gathered together for a single moment meant to settle an argument that had been quietly building since my very first victory. An opponent who had never lost would be fighting under exactly the same pressure I had faced during my very first match, expected to win easily, expected to prove a point the entire Empire was counting on. The difference was that I had already learned how to use that pressure against an opponent, and he had never once needed to. The morning of the match arrived colder than any morning since my capture, or perhaps I simply noticed the cold more, my body remembering every ache from every fight that had led me here. Guards came for me earlier than usual, marching me through corridors lined with more onlookers than I had ever seen before. Other prisoners pressed against cell bars, other species crowding narrow viewing slits, all of them watching the small human who had somehow become something impossible to ignore. Cross caught my eye as they marched me past his cell, and for the first time since our capture, he offered something that looked almost like genuine respect rather than simple military assessment. "Whatever happens out there, Barnes," he said, "you have already proven something none of us expected. That is not nothing." Bell nodded once, silent agreement written across his face. Whitfield simply watched me with steady, unwavering eyes, the same way she had watched every fight from the very beginning, cataloging details I would need to remember later. Odo met me just before the final gate, his 6 eyes wide with something between hope and fear. "They have built the broadcast into something unlike anything before it," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Every world is watching, all at once. Whatever happens today, it will be remembered." I understood that. I had understood it since the moment Odo first told me about this match 7 days ago. This was no longer simply about my survival. Somewhere along the way, without ever intending it, I had become a symbol to species I had never met. Evidence that the Empire's foundational belief in strength above everything else might not be as unbreakable as 300 years of unbroken victories had suggested. I stood at the final gate, listening to the roar building on the other side, louder than anything I had heard since my first match, and I thought about everything that had led me here. A lifetime of being overlooked. A lifetime of losing every contest measured in raw strength. A lifetime spent quietly learning the one lesson that mattered more than any of it. Strength was easy to measure. It was also, I had learned across every fight since my capture, the least reliable predictor of who actually survived. The gate opened, and the light hit me exactly as it had during my very first match, blinding after the dim corridors, followed immediately by a wall of sound unlike anything I had experienced before. This was not the roar of a stadium expecting a quick and easy victory. This was the roar of an empire holding its breath, waiting to see whether everything it believed about itself would survive the next few minutes. I walked out onto the sand, and across from me stood Kaltor, the unbroken wall, exactly as Odo had described him. Tall, patient, utterly still, watching me with none of the mockery I had faced during my first match. He studied me the way a craftsman studies a tool he has never encountered before. Curious, careful, entirely without fear. The commander stood on the platform above, the same one who had once called me nothing, flanked now by figures I had never seen before. Likely leaders from across the Empire's highest ranks, gathered to witness whatever conclusion this match would provide. The horn sounded, sharper and louder than I remembered, echoing across a stadium packed with more creatures than I had ever seen gathered in one place, and somewhere beyond that stadium, across 100 conquered worlds, an audience larger than anything in human history waited to see what would happen next. Kaltor did not move first this time. He waited, patient as Odo had warned, letting the silence stretch between us, testing whether I would break first the way every opponent before me apparently had. I did not move either. I stood perfectly still, studying him the same way he studied me, and for a long moment, the entire stadium held its breath along with us, neither fighter willing to make the first mistake in a match the whole Empire was watching. The stillness broke when Kaltor finally advanced, not with the reckless aggression of my earlier opponents, but with slow, deliberate steps that closed the distance between us with unsettling patience. Every movement was controlled, economical, nothing wasted, nothing revealing more than he intended to show. I remembered Whitfield's words from days earlier. He had never had to think about losing. Every one of his 300 victories had taught him the same lesson, and today, that lesson was about to be tested against someone who had spent an entire lifetime finding cracks in exactly this kind of confidence. I did not retreat as he advanced. Retreating was what every fighter before me had apparently done, buying time against his patience until his patience simply outlasted theirs. Instead, I moved sideways, cutting an angle across the sand that forced him to adjust his approach, small but meaningful, a decision he clearly had not expected this early in the match. He adjusted smoothly, without any visible frustration, continuing his advance along the new angle without hesitation. I understood immediately that surprising him with small decisions alone would not be enough. His discipline absorbed minor unpredictability without effort. I needed something larger, something his 300 victories had never once required him to prepare against. I thought about the arena itself, about every detail Odo had described, about the layout I had studied so carefully during those final 2 days of preparation. There was a section of the arena floor, near the edge closest to the platform, where the sand thinned slightly over a drainage grate built into the stadium's foundation. It was barely noticeable unless someone had spent hours studying old broadcasts the way I had, searching for anything that might matter. I began moving toward that section, not directly, not obviously, but through a pattern of angles that would eventually place us both near that thinner patch of ground without revealing my intention too early. Kaltor followed, patient as always, matching my movements with the same careful discipline that had carried him through 300 unbroken victories. When he finally closed the distance, launching the first real strike of the match, I was ready. His attack came exactly the way Odo had described. Controlled aggression meant to end things quickly once an opponent finally came within range. I dropped low, letting the strike pass just above me, and used the momentum of my own movement to slide across the thinner patch of sand toward the edge of the drainage grate. He turned to follow, and for the first time since the match began, his footing shifted slightly, as the ground beneath him gave in a way 300 previous opponents had never forced him to account for. It was nothing dramatic, no dramatic stumble, simply a fraction of a second where his balance required correction instead of remaining perfectly stable. I used that fraction of a second the same way I had used every small opening in every match before this one. The fight that followed was unlike anything I had experienced in the arena so far. Kaltor recovered quickly, faster than any opponent I had faced, but the small disruption to his rhythm had done exactly what I hoped. It had introduced uncertainty into a fighting style built entirely around control, and uncertainty, I had learned across an entire lifetime of being underestimated, was the one thing truly dominant opponents rarely knew how to handle gracefully. We traded exchanges across the sand, each one faster and more dangerous than the last. He landed a glancing blow across my ribs that stole the breath from my lungs and sent pain radiating through my entire side, a mistake in judgment that cost me more than I wanted to admit even to myself. I answered with speed rather than strength, using the same technique that had won my very first match, closing distance faster than his discipline expected, forcing him to adjust to a rhythm that was not his own. The stadium had gone completely silent, thousands of voices holding their breath together, waiting to see which foundational belief would survive the next few seconds. Somewhere beyond that stadium, across 100 worlds I would likely never see with my own eyes, an audience larger than anything in human history watched the same silence stretch out across their own gathering places. Kaltor's patience, I began to realize, was not simply a strategy. It was the only strategy he had ever needed. Every one of his 300 victories had been built on outlasting opponents who eventually broke first, who eventually rushed, who eventually made the single mistake his discipline was perfectly designed to punish. He had never needed a second strategy because he had never once needed it. I was not going to give him the mistake his discipline was waiting for. I intended to keep giving him something his 300 victories had never once prepared him to face. I feinted toward the drainage grate again, and this time he refused to follow, adjusting his stance instead, unwilling to risk his footing a second time. That refusal, small as it seemed, told me everything I needed to know. He was adapting. He was learning, in real time, the same way I had learned across every fight since my capture. But learning in the middle of a fight, I understood better than almost anyone in that entire stadium, was infinitely harder than learning between them. I pressed the advantage, moving faster than I had in any previous match, drawing on reserves of energy I did not know I still possessed. Every fight since my capture had prepared me for this exact moment, teaching me how much further my body could push past what I once believed were its limits. Saltor countered, a blow that would have ended the match instantly had it landed cleanly, but I had already begun moving before he committed to the strike, some instinct built across weeks of careful observation warning me a half-second before conscious thought could catch up. The blow grazed my shoulder instead of striking fully, spinning me across the sand, pain exploding down my entire arm. I did not stay down. I had never once stayed down, not against bigger brothers, not against older cousins, not against every opponent life had ever placed in front of me who assumed my size meant my will would break just as easily. I rose, and something in Kaltor's expression shifted, the first genuine crack I had seen in 300 victories worth of discipline. He had expected that blow to end things. It had not. The match continued, longer than any before it, both of us bleeding, both of us breathing hard, the crowd's silence stretching into something that felt less like anticipation and more like collective disbelief. Neither of us backed away. Neither of us could afford to. I found my final opening not through strength, because I had never once possessed enough of it to matter, but through the same patient observation that had carried me through every match since my capture. Kaltor's discipline, built across 300 victories against opponents who eventually broke first, had never once needed to account for an opponent who simply refused to break at all. When he finally overextended, just slightly, just enough, Driven by frustration his own discipline had never taught him how to manage, I used every ounce of speed and precision my entire lifetime of being underestimated had built into me. The horn sounded, and the stadium's silence shattered into something I had never heard before. Thousands of voices erupting all at once, some in shock, some in something that sounded, impossibly, almost like celebration. I stood over Kaltor, chest heaving, blood mixing with sand, and looked up at the platform where the commander and the Empire's highest leadership stood frozen, staring down at a sight their entire civilization's foundational belief had never once prepared them to witness. The unbroken wall had broken. I did not celebrate. I did not raise my arms in triumph the way I had seen champions do in the murals lining the corridors leading to this arena. I simply stood there, breathing hard, looking up at the commander who had once called me nothing, and let the silence stretch between us, the same way Kaltor and I had let it stretch at the start of the match. Finally I spoke, my voice carrying across the arena through some translation device I had not even realized was capturing my words for the entire Empire to hear. "You measured my strength," I said, "and found nothing. You never once thought to measure what happens when something small refuses to accept the ending you already decided for it." The commander said nothing. Across the stadium, and across 100 worlds watching through broadcasts I would never fully understand the reach of, something had shifted that no amount of discipline or tradition would be able to fully undo. Odo found me afterward, back in the medical bay where guards had reluctantly allowed healers to treat my injuries, his 6 eyes wider than I had ever seen them. "They are already saying it across every conquered world," he said, his voice trembling with something between fear and awe. "The Empire's own broadcast, the one meant to prove strength above all things, instead proved something else entirely." "What is that?" I asked, wincing as a healer worked on the wound across my ribs. "That strength was never truly what determined who survives," Odo said. "Only what those in power wanted everyone else to believe." Cross, Bell, and Whitfield were allowed to see me later that same day, escorted by guards who no longer looked at any of us the way they once had. Cross studied me for a long moment before speaking. "Command back home is never going to believe this," he said. I managed a tired smile despite the pain still radiating through half my body. "Nobody here believed it either," I said, "not until they had no other choice." Bell shook his head slowly, something between disbelief and genuine respect written across his face. "All this time," he said, "we thought strength was the only thing that mattered." Whitfield, quiet as always, offered the only response that truly mattered. "It never was," she said. "We simply never had a reason to learn that lesson until now." In the weeks that followed, word of that match spread further than Odo could fully track, carried across 100 conquered worlds by species who had spent generations believing their subjugation was simply the natural order of things. The Kryvax Empire, an empire built entirely on the worship of unbroken strength, now had to reckon with a single, undeniable truth broadcast to every world it had ever claimed. Their greatest champion, undefeated across 300 matches, had been defeated by the very fighter their own scanning devices had once measured as nothing at all. I do not know exactly what happens next, whether this single victory changes anything permanent about an empire built across centuries of conquest, or whether it simply becomes one more story eventually buried beneath newer spectacles designed to reassert the same old beliefs. But I know this much for certain, learned across every single fight since the moment guards first marched me off that transport ship and called me nothing in front of an entire stadium of onlookers. They can measure whatever they want. Strength, speed, size, every number their devices are capable of capturing. They will never find a way to measure the one thing that carried me through every single fight since the day this all began. The one thing no scanning device across their entire empire had ever thought worth quantifying. They will never find a way to measure how much someone refuses to lose, especially when everyone around them has already decided the ending, long before the fight has even begun. My name is Eli Barnes. Once, an entire empire looked at me and saw nothing worth fearing. Now, across 100 worlds I will likely never see with my own eyes, they know exactly what that mistake cost them.